everyone. Thank you so
Hey,
much
folks.
for tuning into today's Author Talk series, brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 300 library systems across the United States, Canada, and New Zealand, with the goal of making Author Talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator, in conversation with each of the wonderful, best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series. Today, we are happy to welcome award-winning psychologist Ethan Kross to talk to us about his best-selling book, Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It. Hello, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Excited to be here with you and everyone else who's called in to this call.
Yeah, we're super excited to get started. We have a ton of amazing questions. Before we dive in, though, I do want to kind of pause and give everybody some standard housekeeping information that lets everything run a little bit more smoothly. We have compiled some viewer questions, so thank you for submitting those with registration. But we'll also be taking your additional questions, as always, throughout the entirety of this conversation. So when you have a direct question for Ethan, you can click that questions button that you'll find on a tab below this live stream video to submit that question at any point in time. Also, if you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason whatsoever, don't worry. In about 24 hours, you'll receive a thank you for attending email, and it will allow you to find a link to the recording, and the recording will be available for the next couple of months. Now to formally introduce our guest for today. Ethan Kross is one of the world's leading experts on controlling the conscious mind, an award-winning professor and best-selling author in the University of Michigan's top-ranked psychology department and its Ross School of Business. He studies how the conversations people have with themselves impact their health, performance, decisions, and relationships. He's also the founder of the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory. Ethan's research has been published in Science, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, among other peer-reviewed journals. He has participated in policy discussions at the White House and has been interviewed on numerous news outlets, including CBS Evening News, Good Morning America, Anderson Cooper Full Circle, and NPR's Morning Edition. Ethan's national bestseller, Chatter, The Voice in Our Head, Why It Matters, and How to Harness It, was chosen as one of the best new books of the year by the Washington Post, CNN, and USA Today in 2021. So many amazing accolades. Again, thank you so much for being here today. How's your day going so far?
It's great, and it's even better now that I'm talking to you and everyone here. How about your own day?
Well, it's going great. And likewise, even better now. I'm super excited to dive in. We have a lot to talk about. We have questions coming in already, but Abby would like to know if you can start off by telling us a bit about your research. Specifically, when did you first realize that you wanted to pursue studying psychology, and kind of what was the inspiration for your chosen path in research?
Well, I made the decision. And that was a question from Abby?
Yes.
Abby, great question. Thanks for coming here. So I made the decision to formally study psychology early on in college, and I talk about this a little bit in Chatter. In retrospect, I realized I've been thinking about psychology going back to around the time I was 3 or 4 years old, because I was raised in I would argue, a relatively unconventional household with a dad who, on the one hand, really, really liked the New York Yankees and talking to me about the Yankees. But when he wasn't doing that, he loved talking to me about psychological stuff like Eastern philosophy, which he would read about in his spare time. And, my dad wasn't an academic. He wasn't a college grad. He just was consumed with this topic of the mind and how you can master it. And so from the time I'm a little kid, 3 years old, my dad's talking to me about, hey, when bad things happen, here's what you should do. Turn your attention inward. Ask tap into that little voice inside your head. Ask it what you're supposed to do, how you should behave. And when my dad told me those things when I was young, I'd roll my eyes at him. It was kind of annoying, actually. Like, I would have greatly preferred to talk about He-Man and G.I. Joe and other things like that. But, and here's the good news for all the parents on the call, Despite me pretending I wasn't listening, I was indeed listening, and that message penetrated. I listened to what he said, college, and took my first psychology class, and really got into the science behind this idea of the inner voice and introspection, turning our attention inward. And what I learned during that class was, on the one hand, we have this amazing tool, this ability to use our minds to solve problems, innovate, create, work through despair. But this is a really hard tool to manage, because a lot of the time when we're struggling, we turn our attention inward to make sense of a problem, and we end up just spinning further. Anxiety, depression, anger, those kinds of negative feelings bubble up. And so that for me was a giant question. Why do we have this ability to use our mind to solve problems, but it often jams up on us when we need it most? And so um, I decided that that was such an interesting problem. I might as well figure out how to use tools of science to weigh in on it. So that sent me to grad school and where I am today.
Mhm. Amazing. It's it's one of those things. As a parent of a young child, I noticed for the first time that something was sinking in when I tried to. She started saying "get away," my toddler, and so we tried to redirect to "I need some space," and it took a while, but after a few months, she now says "I need some space." So it's like they are listening.
They
Um,
are listening. Keep up
good example.
those lessons, even in face of the eye rolls. I'll just share one of the best moments I had associated with this book was, when you start writing a book like this, and it took me several years to do it. I became so immersed in it. I would talk to my wife and my daughters about it all the time, and they'd be like, "Oh, just stop talking about the book already." And so I did. But a couple of years ago, a couple of summers ago, my one of my daughters took up diving, and diving is this really interesting sport where you spend a lot of time just waiting on your own to get on the diving board, and then once you're on it, everyone's looking at you, and so there's a lot of room for chatter, getting stuck in those negative thought loops to bubble up. And so one day, without any real ulterior motivation behind it, I just asked my daughter, "Hey, what are you doing when you're just hanging out waiting there?" And she rattled off like 3 or 4 of the tools that I talk about in the book and that I've spoken to her about. And so, she said those things to me, and I was like, "Oh." But inside my mind, the visual, if it existed, of what was happening in my brain was
Yeah, exactly.
really, really excited. So,
That's awesome. Okay, so I guess that's a nice segue. Can you tell us what is chatter? What is it about? Can you give us a quick summary of your book?
yeah, okay, so let's do a really quick, like 2-minute primer on what chatter is, how it relates to the inner voice and self talk. So, chatter is the dark side of the inner voice. When I use the phrase inner voice, and when scientists use that phrase, what we're talking about is our ability to silently use language to reflect on our life. And it turns out that this capacity is a veritable superpower that we possess. It lets us do a lot of really extraordinary things that I think we take for granted. And so I'll just rattle off just a few to give you a sense of that. If I were to ask folks here to um, repeat a phone number in their head, so 209-0501, repeat that a few times. Say it in your mind. That's you using your inner voice. If you go to the grocery store and you go down the first or second aisle, and like me, like 30 seconds after you get there, you forget what your partner told you to buy. And then you repeat in your head, "Oh, what did I forget? Eggs, milk, cheese." That's you using your inner voice. Your inner voice is part of what we call our verbal working memory system. This is a basic system of the human mind that lets us keep information active for short periods of time. You use that verbal working memory system every single day, and your inner voice is a critical part of it. We also use our inner voice to simulate and plan. Before I have a big presentation, I have a ritual that I engage in. I will wake up and I'll go for a walk around the hotel, or if it's cold out, in the lobby. And if you were to see me walking, you would just see a guy, like, maybe he looks somewhat friendly, smiling, but I'm not saying anything. But in my mind, I'm going over word for word what I intend to say later that day during the presentation. I'm not just rehearsing what I'm going to say in my head. I then get to the end of the presentation, I simulate. I imagine, what is the most obnoxious audience member? What question are they going to ask me? I hear the question, and then in my head, I articulate this unbelievably elegant response that is always followed by, like, "Yeah." So that doesn't ever really happen. What I'm doing there, I'm using my inner voice to prepare myself, to simulate and plan. People do this before presentations, before dates, before interviews. Let's talk about a third function, self-control. We use our inner voice to motivate and control ourselves. So when I'm exercising and I'm doing these classes that I don't know why I do, I know why I do them, they keep me healthy, but they're quite painful. And the people leading these classes, they tell me to do really painful things. And the instructors in the class are telling me to run faster and jump higher. And I'm thumbs up in my head. I'm rattling off some expletives. Why don't you try to do this? In my head silently. But I'm also coaching myself along. Come on, 3 more sets. You've got this. I'm counting down. There's research which shows that athletes who engage their inner voice in this self-coaching manner end up performing better on performances than those who don't. So that's another thing our inner voice helps us do. And the last benefit I'll flag has to do with, in some ways, it's this magical feature of the inner voice. And I mean that not in a supernatural sense, but really just, wow, the human mind is so interesting.
Mhm.
When we experience adversity, we often try to make sense of what's happening to us. Why is this happening? What does it mean about who I am? And when we ask ourselves those questions, we use our inner voice to start creating a narrative that really shapes our understanding of what we're going through. And ultimately, it shapes our understanding of who we are. So your inner voice plays a key role in really helping shape your identity. So those are just 4 benefits of your inner voice. They're all over the place and they're far-reaching. Those are all the good things. Chatter refers to this dark side of the inner voice. And here the issue is, we've got this amazing tool. We just talked about all the good things it does for us. When we're struggling, when we're rejected, when we're hurt, anxious, sad, we often try to use this tool to work through our problems. We turn our attention inward to try to make sense and understand what we're going through, but we don't come up with clear solutions that point us in a particular direction. Instead, we just start spinning. Right? We get stuck in those negative thoughts. If we were in it all together, this would be the time where I'd ask folks, have you ever experienced this, to raise your hand? Most people here have experienced this kind of event. That's what I call chatter. It is the dark side of the inner voice, and it is one of the big problems I think we face as a species. And I say that based on what I know of the data surrounding the negative implications of chatter. Because if you look at what it does to us, it sinks us in 3 domains of life that I would argue we care a great deal about. It makes it really hard for us to think and perform. It creates friction in our relationships with other people. And it undermines not just our well-being and our subjective sense of how well life is going, but it also degrades our physical health. And so it's a huge problem. It's why I've devoted my career to understanding why it triggers and what we can do about it. And the good news is that there are a lot of science-based tools that we can use to intervene. So hopefully that wasn't too long of a primer there, but now I think we've got all the groundwork out of the way.
Yeah, no, that was a great primer. Thank you. Sean just said, I'm sure you'll answer this question. How do you stop the chatter? But can you explain why it starts in the first place, and how some people can avoid and overcome it and some have a harder time?
Well, Sean, that's a great question. And I can't explain it quickly because there are lots of different tools that we can muster to engage it. But in short, one of the key reasons we get stuck in chatter is a negative experience is triggered, and then we do something that makes a lot of sense on the surface, right? We zoom in on the problem, right? We focus really, really closely on trying to make sense of this issue. And we do that because that's a habit, a tactic that works well for us in many situations throughout our lives. We've got a problem, let's focus in on it. Problem is, we zoom in so narrowly, we get stuck in the emotional details of that experience. And once we get stuck in those emotional details, it makes it really hard for us to think flexibly about what's happening to us, to look at that bigger picture, which is where solutions to the problem often lie. There is no single way, there's no single tool that you can use to manage every form of chatter that you may experience throughout your life. If people say, hey, here's the one thing you should do, I get asked this question all the time, what's the one thing you should do to manage chatter? We know that there isn't a one size fits all solution that helps people. What we instead also know, there are a range of tools that help people. And to get to the conclusion, from the start here, the real challenge I think we all face is to familiarize ourselves with the different tools that are out there, and then start trying the combinations that work best for you as a individual dealing with the unique kinds of chatter that you're struggling with. Find what those tools are and then implement them. I like to divide this tool space into three buckets. There are things you can do on your own, so tools that are self-generated, small ways of shifting the way we talk to ourselves that can make a difference. There are people tools. There are ways of interacting with other people in very specific ways that can help us or hurt us. A lot of people think you just want to find someone to talk to when you're dealing with chatter. That is not what the science suggests. There are ways of talking to people that can make our chatter much, much worse. And then there are ways of doing it that can really aid us. And then there's a third bucket of tools that I call environmental tools, which deal with ways of interacting with your physical spaces that can change the nature of the conversations we have with ourselves from the outside in. So that's kind of a framework, tools you can use on your own, people tools or relationship tools, and environmental tools. And there are lots of individual tactics in each one of those places. And we will, I'm sure, get through this. Although, Brandon, you are the maestro here, so you will
Yeah.
lead me wherever you want.
Well, I mean, you said something about kind of the power and peril of other people. Like chapter five's title, and we have a lot of questions about kind of ill-advised feedback from when it's coming from other people and kind of adding to the negative chatter. AIM specifically is saying, what are some strategies to stay focused with purpose and negate negative feelings as you begin challenging tasks or projects? But most importantly, how best to respond to that negative and ill-advised feedback that other people bring to your chatter.
Well, I think the way to start when it comes to other people is to think really carefully about who you're talking to about your chatter. I like to use the metaphor of an advisory board. So you think about companies. Companies go to great lengths to carefully select people to put on their corporate board to advise them when the companies need help with things. I think we would all benefit from doing something similar when it comes to our own lives, and think really carefully who's on our personal board of advisors,
Mhm.
because who you talk to can play a powerful role in shaping the way you think about your life. So many people think that the way to both get and provide good support to others. So let's just keep it simple, actually. Many people think that the way to get good chatter support is just to find someone to dump their emotions to, just vent how they're feeling. This is an old idea, goes back to Aristotle. Freud popularized it. It's been with us ever since. The notion is don't keep the pain bottled up inside, get it out, vent the emotions, release the safety valve, let it go.
It's like going to a therapist and just saying everything and they never say anything to you.
Just dumping it.
Yeah.
There's been research on this, and here's what we've learned. Sharing, just letting the emotions out, sharing the emotions, this is really good for strengthening the friendship and relational bonds between two people. It's good to know that there's someone else out there who cares about you, is willing to take the time to listen to you, to empathize with you, to normalize your experience. All that's good. The issue is it's good for the relationship. If that's all you do in the conversation, you often leave that conversation feeling really good about the person you just shared your emotions with, but you're just as upset about the problem as you were when you started, because you haven't done anything in that conversation to work through it, to reframe that problem, to look at the bigger picture. The best kinds of conversations when it comes to chatter do two things. You're talking to a person who does take the time to first listen and hear you out. It is important for them to learn about what you're going through, to empathize with you, for you to feel heard. But at a certain point in that conversation, they start working with you to broaden your perspective. Other people are in an ideal position to help you find solutions to what you're going through, because they have the psychological distance from the event. It's not happening to them. They can be really objective. And so ideally, you're talking to people who do both of those things for you. They first listen, hear you out, but they then shift into this kind of advisory mode. Now, there is an art to doing this well. As a scientist, I'm not used to talking about art. I like art in my spare time, but we don't tend to talk in terms of artistry. But there is an art form to do this. And what I mean by this is the following. depending on who the person is and what they're struggling with, some people need to spend more time just sharing the emotions before they're ready to transition into that kind of advisory reframing part of the conversation. And so, as the more you do this when you're on the support provision side of things, the better you'll get at this. Um, but my advice to folks, if you're talking to someone else, they're coming to you with a problem, and you're not sure whether to just keep listening or switch into advisory mode, just ask the person. I do this with my wife all the time. I hope she's not listening in on this. I'll get in trouble. But but what I do is, she'll, "Hey, can I talk to you about a problem?" "Of course. What's going on? Tell me." She starts talking. I listen. I'm empathizing. It's genuine engagement. At a certain point in the conversation, I think I know enough. I think she's expressed enough. I'll sometimes just say, "Hey, I totally get it. I have a thought. Can I share?" And sometimes she says, "Yes, please. What do you think? This is why I'm talking to you." Other times she's like, "No, just hear me out. I'm not done yet." And if she utters if that's what she says, I'll keep listening a little bit more, and then I'll try a little bit later to advise. And so that is really the art of getting and also providing good chatter support. And so what I encourage everyone to do, there's an exercise I do when I'm doing like workshops on this. I would ask you to list all the people you talk to about your chatter. Just make go as long as you need to go. Some people have 0 names, other people will have like 20. And once you list everyone, then think about each individual. Do they do both of these things for you? Do they both listen and help advise and help you reframe, or do they just do one or the other? Circle the names of the people who do both. That's the beginnings of your chatter advisory board. Those are the people to start talking to. And then you can figure out what to do with the rest of the folks. Maybe you just talk to them about vacations and the kids and cooking or whatever. Or maybe you educate them about how all this works and help them become a better advisor.
Mhm. That's a great idea, because there are people that you can vent to and they never say anything, and that's exactly what they are, but they shouldn't be on the advisory board because they're not offering helpful feedback when you need it. That's
Right.
great. So Aletha is wondering, why is the negative chatter, the dark side, so much more dominant than our positive inner voice?
Um, Another fantastic question, and it lets me tell you about one of my favorite findings in psychology.
Mm,
Not favorite because it's a positive finding, but just something that we've learned, which is bad is stronger than good. The negative stuff in our lives outweighs the positive stuff
mm,
by a very large margin. There's an evolutionary explanation for this, which is that the bad stuff in life is more threatening. It is more relevant to our survival than the good stuff. There are very few psychologists who've won a Nobel Prize. One of those Nobel Prize winners won the prize for the discovery of something called loss aversion. We're more sensitive to losses than we are to gains. And so the idea here is that those negative things, we're more sensitive to them. And that's why oftentimes when people think of their inner voice, they instantly think of that inner critic, that nag, that disparaging voice, the jerk, you put your favorite description on it. This is why I like to spend time in all the conversations that I have about the inner voice explaining how much benefit it can provide for us. A lot of people, when they're struggling, they think to themselves, "I just want to get rid of this inner voice." This is not something you would want to do. The real challenge we face is to learn how to harness this tool, right? How do you figure out how to free your inner voice up to do all the wonderful things it evolved to do without falling into that rabbit hole of chatter? That's the challenge I think we all face.
mhm. Absolutely. And what about people then with maybe like anxiety or depression or ADD? Does their chatter kind of present differently? Is it harder to harness and turn into positivity if you have maybe a mental health issue that you're struggling with?
Well, the difference between we tend to talk about mental health and illness in very binary categorical terms. You've got it or you don't. I'm of the belief that these issues largely exist on a continuum. So, and the boundaries are often fuzzy between normal problems of living and clinical issues. Nonetheless, there are criteria that explain when you go into the clinical um, bucket, so to speak. What it tends to be characterized is chatter that is both longer lasting and more severe. So chatter is it is an everyday part of the human experience. I've yet to interact with an audience that doesn't experience chatter at times. Um, if you find that the chatter is just hanging around for a really long period and is quite intense, that's a cue to maybe get additional help beyond self-initiated tools to assist. But I talk about like close to 30 science-based tools in my book. A number of those tools have been shown to be useful with clinical populations. Others haven't been studied in that context. Sometimes, interestingly, and this was a really surprising thing for us in research, sometimes we find that the same tool is actually more effective for a person who's struggling with big emotions than a person who's struggling with just a kind of more minor problem of living. And the idea here, the connection we draw is similar to how Tylenol works for reducing a fever. If you've got a 99 temperature, it's not even a fever, and you take a Tylenol, it's going to bring it down just a few decimal points, right? But if your fever's up at 104 and you take that Tylenol, you see a much larger decrease. And the idea is that there's a lot more room for the Tylenol to have its effect when your temperature is spiking higher. We think the same is true for many of these tools. The more negative emotion there is to work with, the more benefit that they may provide.
And so then with that, Carol is then wondering, what are some of those like tips and tools on how to prepare for an upcoming potentially anxiety producing event?
Okay, well, let me know. You won't. Was that Carol?
Yeah, Carol.
Carol, you don't want me to talk to you about all 30 right now because that would require me to speak
Your
so fast that
favorite one.
I would throw everyone would leave. But let me just give you a couple of let me talk to you about the tools that I use.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
And again, we know different tools work for different people. So I'll give you just a few to give you a flavor of this toolbox that exists. So one of the first tools that I use is something called distant self-talk. And just hear me out before you think to yourself, this is nuts. I will explain it's not. I use my own name and the word you to give myself advice, to coach myself through a problem like I would give advice to a friend. All right, Ethan, how are you going to manage this situation? I do that silently. I don't do it out loud while walking down the streets of a major urban area. Some people do find it useful to talk to themselves out loud and use this tool using their name to coach themselves through a problem out loud. If that's you and you're listening here, I would encourage you to do that with these things in your ear, not necessarily an advertisement for Apple. Any earbud will do. Talking out loud just violates social norms. So that's why I like to give that disclaimer. But back to this distant self-talk. So why is using my name and the word you useful for me? Well, we know from lots of research that we in general, human beings, we're much better at giving advice to other people than we are giving and following advice ourselves. There's a name for this phenomenon. It's called Solomon's paradox, named after the Bible's King Solomon, who was famous for being a wise leader. People came from all over the world to get his advice, but if you look at his own life, made a bunch of bad decisions. Many people have had this experience. They can tell others what to do, but when the problem's happening to them, they struggle. Distant self-talk plays on this idea. When you use your name and the word you to think about yourself, it's effectively shifting your perspective. It's getting you to think about yourself more similar to how we think about other people. And that makes it a lot easier for us to give ourselves rational, sound advice. So that's one of the first things I do. All right, Ethan, how are you going to deal with this? Another thing I do is something called mental time travel. A lot of you've probably heard that the focus when you're experiencing chatter is you want to be in the moment. Brandon, is this common territory? Have you heard that? Like be in the now,
Yeah.
focus on the moment. Pretty common nowadays. Um, that can be useful at times, but I think it also points us in a potentially dangerous direction because it's not possible to always be in the moment. And in fact, the human mind evolved to travel in time. There are animals that are always in the moment. They tend to be like multiple appendages, antennae all over the place, cockroaches, spiders, that kind of thing, right? They're always in the moment. But what we can do, we can travel in time in our mind. We can think about the future. We can go into the past. Um, One tool that has been shown to be effective for people when they're struggling with chatters, think about how you're going to feel about this problem you have tomorrow, next week, next month, 5 years from now. All emotions have a time course. They get triggered, they peak, and then they eventually subside. When we're struggling with chatter, we lose sight of that. But simply reminding ourselves that our emotions are impermanent does something really powerful for a chatter prone mind. It gives us hope that things are going to get better. And that turns the volume down in our chatter. So this is actually my what I call my 2 a.m. chatter strategy, because every 5 to 6 weeks, it's unpredictable. I will wake up at 2 a.m. I will be overcome with chatter. And then the question is, what do I do? Do I watch Netflix? Do I go downstairs, read a book? I jump in the mental time travel machine. I use my name to do it. I go, Ethan, how are you going to feel about this tomorrow morning? No matter how bad the chatter is at 2 a.m., I always feel better about it in the morning when my brain is fully active and I can think more
Mhm.
constructively. So that's two things: mental time travel, distant self-talk. I have a great chatter advisory board. I have that board not because I was born in any privileged way into having these wonderful relationships. I've worked hard to prune that advisory board, and I will consult it when I'm struggling with some chatter. If those first two tools weren't quite enough, I'll call those individuals up. Couple of there are 4 or 5 people for I go to for personal chatter, 5 or 6 for work related stuff. There's a little bit of overlap on those boards, not much. That's another tool I'll use. And let me highlight 2 other ones really quick. I will enhance my exposure to green spaces. I'll go for a walk in a natural setting. Um, I should confess to folks, I was deeply skeptical of research showing that enhancing your exposure to green spaces can improve the way your mind operates and help with chatter. I say that because I'm a born and bred urbanite. I grew up in New York, and most of the green spaces around the neighborhoods that I grew up with were like not friendly places. You'd have to be a little bit careful when you went there. And so I've done some of this research. I've read the literature, and I have found it to be really compelling. So if I'm struggling with some chatter, I'll go for a walk in the park not far from my house.
Mhm.
That's a fourth thing I'll do. Maybe I should stop there because I'll give you a break to chime in.
You presented a lot of great tips just then, but what it got me thinking about is when when is it that your chatter is too much, that maybe even um, your chatter advisory board isn't enough. Specifically to Suzanne's question, Suzanne said, "What's your best advice for someone whose inner voice is telling them to do things that harm them? For example, self-harming behaviors, maybe even eating disorders. So when is it too much and you need to actually seek help?"
Well, I think number one, if you're wondering whether you should seek help, you probably should. And if you do seek help, you know, go if you're wondering where to find it. A good place to start is a local university or health center. And what you really want to look for is someone who is clinically licensed and practices an empirically supported form of intervention. And what that means is just it's a science driven approach. There are a lot of folks out there who try to help people. They're well intended, but they're not using science as their guide. And I think the best chance we can give anyone to succeed is really by utilizing science. So if you're wondering whether it's appropriate to get help, be conservative and take those steps. There are some clinical criteria that you can use. So, in general, for a formal diagnosis of anxiety and depression, there are many things that go into it. It's complicated, but two shortcuts that you can use is if the chatter is being heard at a really intense level, to the point where it's interfering with your ability to live the life you want to live on a daily basis. That is a subjective criteria, but that is what we use. If it is interfering with that for more than 2 weeks, that's another clue that you want to speak to someone to get some professional help. Certainly, if there's self harm issues, though, that's always something that we're really sensitive about.
Mhm. We have an interesting question about the inner voice in general, and maybe drawing distinctions between like different types of voices in our heads. Claudia is saying, how can my inner voice be affected by my inner child? And how do I differentiate between the two? Um, yeah, we can start there.
Well, I love these questions about the phenomenology of the inner voice. It was one of my favorite parts of researching the book. Really had me dig into these issues. So one thing to keep in mind is that we're capable of hearing all sorts of voices. We typically talk about voice hearing as being associated with certain clinical populations and demographics. Not true. We all of us can hear these different kinds of voices in our minds. So if I were to ask folks here, like, here, I want you to simulate the voice of your mom or dad or caretaker telling you to make your bed. Brandon, why don't you do it right now? You can be my little guinea pig here. Um, Take a second. Can you hear your mom telling you to make your bed, or your dad or your caretaker?
Really clearly, I just saw her like 2 weeks ago, so I can hear it.
You can hear it. There you go. So we are capable of simulating all sorts of voices in our mind. One difference between normal voice hearing and various clinical versions of that is, I'm guessing, Brandon, that you were fully aware that you conjured up that simulation of your mom in your head. You didn't think that she was in there telling you to make your bed. Fair assumption to make?
Yeah, not this time anyway. Yeah.
Right. So that so that can sometimes lead to other kinds of issues if you're not aware that you are creating those simulations in your mind. But inner child, inner adult, high school wrestling coach. I sometimes hear his voice when I'm doing things. We're capable of hearing all of those different sorts of voices. Some people are often curious about hearing impaired populations. So
Mhm.
people. Who don't communicate verbally. There's some very interesting research, not as much as I'd like, but really interesting, showing that they talk to themselves too, but they do it in the same modality that they use to talk and to communicate with other people. That is, they actually visualize signing to themselves in their mind, which I think is just totally fascinating. So
Yeah.
I hope that kind of gets at your question.
Yeah, that's very yeah, that's very interesting. I guess I never would have thought about signing as an inner voice, because then it instantly makes me think about, like, well, what about a baby that's born deaf?
Well, I mean, and that's where that. I mean, I think this is fascinating research. I covered a little bit in one of the chapters on chatter, but this is, yeah, the question. Like, so is this capacity to communicate with ourselves fundamental to the human mind and how it operates? And if it is, then you would expect there to be some manifestation of it in populations, groups of individuals who have their linguistic apparatus impaired. And in fact, we see some evidence that that is true.
Hmm. It also kind of makes me think about even maybe people who are multilingual, and kind of that connection between chatter and memory. Like, what is the dominant voice?
Some fascinating research, and everyone here, lucky you, because this did not make it. This was on the cutting room floor of the book. I had a whole section on um, how thinking in a foreign language impacts the way we think, feel, and behave. And there's some wonderful work showing that for those of you here who speak a second language and acquired a second language after your first, so you're not bilingual in the sense of from the beginning you spoke two languages at the same time, you learn them at the same time. But like me, you may have learned a second language in elementary, middle, or high school or beyond. There's research which shows that thinking about your problems in a second language actually reduces their emotional sting. And as a kind of proof of principle of this, I'd encourage those of you here who speak a second language to think about, or even try doing it, try cursing in a second language. There's research which shows, and I've definitely experienced this to be true. Brandon, I'm curious if this is true for you. For some reason, cursing in a second language, it feels kind of silly, but it doesn't have the same kind of taboo quality that it does when I utter those expletives in my native language. I had a colleague actually visit a few years ago from Israel, and he for whatever reason, we were doing brain science, and when we weren't doing that, we're walking around Ann Arbor, and he's to Ethan, say this. And he tells me what the word is in Hebrew. Terrible words. And he laughs, he giggles. I say them. There's nothing taboo about them. But I would never dare say that word in my native tongue. Why is this? Well, when we first in our when we are learning how to speak in our native language, that's the language that we're learning about emotions. So the link between our primary language and emotion is very tight. Our second language is often acquired in a more clinical context in schools, right? We're learning this not on the playground or at homes, but we're memorizing in a very formal sense. And we think that that's one of the reasons why um, the languages we speak, the different languages have different links with emotionality. So one interesting factoid.
That is interesting. I have started cursing in German a lot around my daughter. So I don't know what a lot means to some people, but so just so that she doesn't pick up those habits. And when I do it, you're right. It takes the sting away. I don't feel as frustrated or angry as I would have felt having said it in English. Um, and I just move on with my day.
Now you can get in trouble. I'll share with folks. So I don't speak Italian. I'm not Italian, but I grew up in a neighborhood where there were a lot of Italian folks, and so I learned a couple of those bad words. And so I have, on occasion, like you, in front of my kids, uttered an Italian expletive or two, and my kids have learned what they are. Fast forward, we end up overseas in Italy, and something happens, and my kids are saying, say that word. I'm like, no, we can't go there. So they'll
No.
kick us out of the country.
Well, so we've received quite a few questions about children and their inner voice. Um, April is saying, how can we teach these concepts to adolescents? And Anna is saying, what kind of tools can we use to help children with their inner voice? So they might be kind of the same question.
Yeah, I think this is so let's just back up a second. Thank you for asking these questions, first of all. There's so much rich material here, and there's only so much you get to an hour, and this is really important. So I'm glad you brought it up. Um, our caretakers, they, in a very powerful sense, shape the conversations that we have with ourselves. This is in part how we learn how to control ourselves is by listening to the things our parents say to us, repeating those phrases, those things in our mind. Sometimes actually repeat them out loud. Actually, if you've got little kids, you've probably seen them talk out loud to themselves, or when they're playing with us. Oh, Jimmy shouldn't do this, and Jackie should go here. And part of the way kids learn self-control is by first out loud repeating self-control directives that their parents communicate to them. But then we say those things, repeat those phrases in our head. So as parents, we're playing a real powerful role in shaping our children, how they talk to themselves. And so, number one, and I do this with my kids, I think you absolutely want to have conversations about what it means to have an inner voice. What does it do for us? Of the sort that we had earlier in this conversation today, like, what is it? And then what are the tools that can be used to help us manage those conversations that we have with ourselves? I find it remarkable that, um, in elementary, middle, and high school, I had a class in biology, and I learned about all the different systems that are inside us. And for whatever reason, the one nugget that I've always remembered had to do with the digestive system and peristalsis. Do you remember learning about peristalsis, Brandon? Do you remember what that is? I'm
I don't
happy to
think that one
explain.
stuck with me.
Okay, that one's so peristalsis. You ready for it? It is the process that explains how you get food from one opening to another. It's that squeezing of the
Okay.
track. Okay, push. Just you'll see where I'm going with this. If you were to ask me, hey, how many occasions have you had to use your knowledge of peristalsis in your adult life? What I would respond is two. Both of my daughters independently asked me when they were growing up, Daddy, how do you swallow food upside down? And I was like, peristalsis. That explains how you can do that. That's why it doesn't come right out. Ask me, how many times have I had occasion to use my knowledge of the inner voice and chatter and how to manage it? Virtually every day, there is some occasion to think about how to rein in our emotions. So, to go back to kids, I think it's a huge problem that we're not teaching kids about how the mind works in this way. to give them tools that they can use to manage their emotions throughout their lives, because they're going to have occasion, no matter how well adjusted they are, to deal with these kinds of experiences. This is a great segue, actually, to tell you about a project that we recently completed
Great.
that bears on this issue. So, and this is actually one of the reasons I actually decided to write Chatter. Several years ago, I was teaching a class to graduating seniors here at Michigan on the science of self-control. And so you could think about this class as science's greatest hits when it comes to managing the human mind. It's a class I taught several times, and one of the things that happens with a class that you teach several times is you tend to get the same questions over and over, and so you've got answers just queued up to answer them. You pretend you don't. Oh, it's a good question, but you've got those answers ready to go. Fast forward to the last day of this class. The assignment to students was to come with any questions they have for me about this topic. The first student to raise her hand was a girl named Ariel, and she's like, raise her hand really strongly, wanting to be called on, and she's visibly angry. She says, "Why hasn't anyone taught us about this before?" I had no idea what to say to her. Never got that question before. And so my initial response was media training 101. It's a really good question, Ariel. What do other people think about that? And so I threw it back to the students, but I'm thinking about the answer to that question in my head. Didn't have a good one. And so what I ended up doing was putting a team together of scientists and educators, teachers, and curriculum designers to take what we know about managing our emotions, managing our chatter, take that science, and let's work together to create really engaging, sticky lessons, a curriculum that teaches students about this material. We created that curriculum, and about a year ago, or maybe two, we ran it actually during COVID. Thousands of high school students were put through either this curriculum that teaches students about how to manage their emotions, and they were compared against a control group of students who learned about a different topic of psychology. And what we learned was really exciting. Three things. Number one, the students who went through the self-control curriculum, when you compare their knowledge of how the mind works when it comes to emotions and managing them, at the end of the study, they knew a whole lot more than they did at the beginning. So they learn information. That's already a win. We then look at, do kids who go through this self-control curriculum, do they actually use the tools that they learn about in their daily life when they're struggling with problems? Yes, they do. They use those tools significantly more than kids in the other curriculum. And then the final question that we looked at was, does this knowledge have any implications for how well they do in school? What we learned was the more kids learned about this knowledge, the more their knowledge of how to manage their emotions improved, the more their GPA improved from the beginning of the semester to the end. And so we find this to be really, really exciting. And I think it's a great proof of principle that we shouldn't be waiting to teach our kids about this stuff until they're a senior in college. And many seniors never get this. We need to start much earlier. And so I would encourage you all to start having these conversations with your kids. I'm going to move my camera because I think I'm getting like subtly heckled by someone in my house in the background. There we go. Distracting.
That is, so could you, when you're thinking of toddlers, would some of those things about maybe inner voice translate to like feelings, like when you're teaching them about feelings and like how to cope with being angry?
Well, and it was a fantastic question, and I'm jumping in out of excitement because I sense where you're going, and I agree. There are different ways of intervening, right? And so that there, I'm reversed. That book over there, Chatter, like that's pitched for a young adult and beyond population. Let's say high school and up, maybe a little bit of advanced middle school, but clearly you want to talk about this information in different ways for depending on the group's age. And you also want to take into account the actual apparatus, the physical apparatus we have to implement some of the tools that I talk about matures over the lifespan, which is to say our prefrontal cortex, which is a big piece of our ability to use tools consciously to rein in our emotions, that prefrontal cortex is developing over time. And so the tools that I would use with a young, really young kid, 3 or 4, even smaller, are different from high school and beyond.
Sure.
Attention's a really powerful tool for younger kids, right? Like, um, if a kid is my kids get obsessed with their boo boos. Does anyone else when they were little like, oh oh my god, right? And so like
Not an actual scratch. It still needs a band-aid.
it's a scratch, right? It's just a graze. We could go on about this, right? So attention here is like distracting them. Very powerful tool, right? And so you could do this even with little kids, like distract their attention right away. Little kids are also often referencing you as a parent to inform themselves about how they should feel about things, right? So, and this is something that happens very early on. Emotions are literally contagious. There's a whole set of interesting findings that speak to the contagion of emotion. So the little kid, stumbles or is really struggling with something, pretend it's something minor, it doesn't exist. Turn their attention elsewhere. That's another important thing. I think we also, for little kids, I think we want to be normalizing um, our experience of negative and positive emotions.
Mhm.
Negative emotions aren't a bad thing. We evolve the ability to experience negative emotions for a reason. Anger is not toxic. Anger is an emotion that is a signal that tells us, hey, something just happened in this world, and there's still the chance for us to fix it. That's when you experience anger. Sadness is different. Something just happened that we're not happy about, and we can't really fix the situation. And that puts us in different trajectories for that equip us for how to deal with those things. So I think you also want to just explain to kids, why do we have emotions? What do they do for us? And then also distinguish between healthy and more unhealthy emotions. But certainly start having those conversations early on.
Good. Thank you. Um, Tara is wondering, what do you think was the original purpose of the voice inside the head? Since culture affects our self-talk, how do you think the breakdown of civility in our public discourse might affect the way we talk to ourselves?
Okay, Tara, big questions with multiple parts. So I think of language and the inner voice as a tool of the mind. I think this is something we evolved. It's an adaptation that we evolved to help us be more successful in the way we navigate the world. And I think there's ample evidence to support the fact that language and the diverse ways that we can use language to think about our lives silently is an amazing tool. And I gave you a couple examples of that earlier. Keeping information active, simulating and planning, thinking abstractly, controlling yourself, motivating yourself, creating narratives. You wouldn't want to live life without that capacity. In fact, I actually tell a story in Chatter about a woman who had a stroke and temporarily lost her ability to use language. So a blood vessel popped around the parts of her brain that are involved in speech production. She was significantly impaired as a kind of proof of principle case study that speaks to how important this inner voice is in our ability to thrive in life. Let's talk about culture, though. Culture absolutely shapes the kinds of conversations we have with ourselves. This is why I think we have to be so careful about who we choose to have conversations with, what kinds of information we bathe ourselves in. And I'm talking here about social media. Think about diving down the wrong set of Twitter feeds. This is giving you information that is, in a certain sense, shaping how you think about the world and what kinds of conversations you have with yourself. We think about our kids, I think really carefully about who their peers are. I have seen, as my children have gotten older and they're kind of testing out different groups, and you can see how the kids that they're talking to are changing the way that they're talking to not only my wife and myself, but also it changes the way they talk to themselves. They have different kinds of concerns that are becoming active. We do not exist in a vacuum. We are a social species. And so taking not only other people into account, but also the broader culture that we are bathing ourselves in, I think is vitally important. This is why organizations, I think, should care about this a great deal. What are the norms that characterize your organizations when it comes to chatter, when it comes to our emotional lives? these are important things that we don't want to ignore.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Makes me think about when I was a teenager and my mom and dad being like, I don't want you to hang out with those people anymore. Because it was functionally changing me.
It's really, and a lot of parents struggle with this transition. When your kids are little, you are the primary source of influence in their lives. As they get older, that transitions to their peer group, and so the peer groups just are really important. And by analogy, like on social media, who are the people you're connecting with
Yeah.
and hang out? We often talk about social media as, in current times, a toxic force that is bringing about the end of civilization. I think it's a little too extreme. It can be very, very harmful if you use it the wrong way for certain people. But it can also be a source of support and amusement if you use it in other ways. And so I think the key here is to not just stumble into it, but to be a little bit more strategic about this. And so I get into some of these issues as well in the book.
Hmm. Yeah. So Ben is asking last couple of questions, I guess, as we're wrapping up here. It's gone so fast. Um, Ben is asking or saying, you've done such amazing and utterly fascinating research. What have you learned along the way that surprised you the most?
I continue to be surprised. I continue to be proven wrong, and that's part of science. Giving you some concretes. Um, okay, the environment, the impact that green space exposure can have on us. That was an aha experience for me. I took it for granted. I thought trees, all right, they look nice from afar. I didn't think they could actually help me manage my mind. Um, Cleaning and organizing. I am not, my office is pretty tidy right now. I knew we'd be talking. My wife would kill me if it was not
Yeah.
in better shape. But if you were to ask my wife, what's her like biggest pet peeve about me? I think up there would be the fact that I'm the kind of carefree. There are usually like stacks of books everywhere, and there's a trail of clothing from the shower to the closet to the bedroom. But when I'm experiencing chatter, I put everything away nice and tidy. I create order. I do that in my office, and I'll go in the kitchen. I'll clean up and put things away. A lot of people report cleaning and organizing when they're experiencing chatter, and we understand why they do that now. When you're experiencing chatter, you often feel like you don't have control over what's happening in here. Your thoughts are taken over. You can compensate for that lack of a feeling of control inside by exerting order and control around you. And so that was wow. Okay, now I understand why I do this, why I clean and organize when I'm struggling. This, by the way, this principle also explains why when people are really stressed out with chatter, why they're more likely to believe in engage in like conspiracy theorizing, why they're likely to scapegoat. It's because engaging in those behaviors provide them with a sense of order and control. That was that was an aha. The last thing I'll say is the power of language to impact how we talk to ourselves. I really do use distant self talk quite a bit in my own life. Ethan, what are you doing here? And how those shifts can impact us, I found really interesting. And on the final bit on that, I would say is once your antenna are out and you're looking for examples of people doing that, I see examples of people doing it all the time. LeBron James, Jennifer Lawrence, Salvador Dali, the list goes on and on. You see people when they're struggling, they do this weird thing. They use their name to try to work through their problems. And now we have some understanding of why that is. And so those are a couple of ahas.
So Alice is wondering how everybody finds your podcast on this subject.
Well, you can, well, thank you for that question. You can go to my website, Ethan Kross, KROSS.com. I should know that better. And I just did. There are some resources there, podcast interview links. I'm on social media, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and you can search for me on Apple Podcasts and you'll find a bunch of stuff coming up.
Great, thank you. Last question, if we have time. I know we're at the top of the hour.
Let's do it. Yeah, no, let's go for it.
Bex is saying, who are the experts that you follow in your field for professional development? And what are you listening to or reading or watching?
Ooh, great question. there are lots of experts in this space. Uh, Angela Duckworth is great. Katie Milkman, Jamil Zaki, Vanessa Bones are some names that come to mind. Um, what am I listening to? I'm reading lots of journal articles, so I do just get in there and keep up with the science because I'm running a lab and staying abreast of it. Um, Interestingly enough, when it comes to nonfiction, I try to go elsewhere. I love reading memoirs and biographies. I find them really fascinating to just learn about people's lives, and oftentimes there are ideas for science that comes out of that kind of reading. Um, so I tend to read more in that genre than I do in kind of popular nonfiction. But those are some ideas.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly been a pleasure and a breeze speaking with you for the last hour. And thank you very much for your important research and work.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for listening in. I wish you chatter-free days, and I love this mechanism. So I hope it continues this consortium for a very long time. I think it's wonderful.
Thank you. I also want to extend, of course, a huge thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. And we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, one of those three tabs, you can find a link to Ethan's book under the resources tab. We look forward to seeing you all on July 25th when we chat with New York Times bestselling author and memoirist Erica L. Sanchez about her most recent book, Crying in the Bathroom. You can register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.